Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone to this week's edition of Imperial as One's Belonging series, where we explore the lived experiences of people from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds. And this week, as I say every week, I've got a really special guest with us because they are all special. But this week we've got Amberlee Green, and it's a real privilege to have Amberlee. I've known of her. I went to a workshop with her many years ago, and it was a very, very good workshop. And so for her to be a guest on here is just a real pleasure. So Amberlee, I'm going to start off by asking my usual question. And that question is, can you give us a little bit of an insight of what it is that gave you your sense of belonging, your sense of identity as you were growing up?
I mean, that's a huge question. There are so many things that I think contribute to belonging. I think family and upbringing is probably my main contribution to how I feel now. Mm-hmm. I work in academia like many of us do, which is a very white space, but I've been brought up in a household that was very clear on who we were, who we are, what we stand for, what our values are, which means that when you bring that into any space where you are a minority, so to speak, or you might feel different or other in any way, you kind of already come knowing kind of what you contribute to a space and what it is that you're bringing to that space, but also what you want to take out. What I want to take out of it. So I think upbringing has been one of my main contributions. I also think when I think about this term belonging, that working in mental health, which is obviously one of the things that I do, means that you're always kind of thinking about the self. It's kind of hard to move through any space without thinking about yourself, because that's kind of what we're in the business of, aren't we? So that's kind of built up this understanding I have of my sense of self, and just things like self-worth and self-esteem, all these things that build up our frame of reference and allow us to interact with the world. You know, working in this field means that I've got a bit more of an understanding of what self means, and that's really helped.
Yeah. So you highlighted that family is incredibly important, and the contribution which family made in helping you to find your identity. Can you give us any specific examples of what it is that your family used to do or currently do to help you to be who you are? Can you give anything specifically?
Definitely. So I am from a Jamaican background. My parents are both Jamaican. I was born here in South London, born and raised here. My parents are they're very supportive I know the word supportive, I think is thrown around quite a lot. So everyone can use the word supportive and it means different things to everyone. But my parents are supportive in a very kind of open, you can do whatever you want to do kind of way. A lot of the, back to your previous question about belonging, I feel like a lot of my kind of personality traits and characteristics have contributed to that. And I can really accredit all of those things to either mum or dad. The way that I like friendliness and openness and talkativeness and curiosity, I get that very directly from my mum, for example. This kind of inquisitiveness and wanting to know more and wanting things to be done well, I get that very specifically from my dad. So I think when you live in a household where your parents are very there and you kind of come across them in many different ways each day, you can't help but realize that there are bits about you that you get directly from each of them. So just simple things like their response. You know, I do quite a lot of different things. My career at the moment has quite a lot of different strands that are quite complementary now, but over the years have felt, I think, quite different and quite new. And they've always been very much like, yeah, that sounds great, go and do it. If you want to do it, go and do it, without me ever feeling like I have to explain myself or limit what I should do in order to live up to expectations that they might have for me. It seems like I've never had that barrier, and that's been brilliant.
So they've encouraged and enabled you to do whatever it is that you wanted to do.
Yeah, enabling is a great word. Definitely enablers, very much. Like, as soon as you mention something, if they feel like it's something that feels aligned with you, they'll be like, what happened to that? Are you still doing that thing that you mentioned? That was a good plan. You should go and do that.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's really good, especially when people think about the contribution which parents make, the contribution which siblings make
Mm.
in either lifting someone else or and pulling them down
Yeah,
at
yeah.
the same time. The sense which you've always had is you can do it.
Very
Whether
much
or not
so.
they've known exactly what it was that you were referring to, sounds like a good idea. Go ahead. There
Yes,
wasn't. It was a glass was half full, not glass half empty.
definitely. I
Yeah,
definitely think so. My mom is really optimistic and can do
yeah.
in terms of her attitude, which I feel like I've got as well. There's been times where I've just thought, I can't do this. But for the most part, I'm also pretty glass half full as well.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I'm just wondering. So at home, you had this you can do attitude from your parents, and go on, you try it. What about growing up when you grew up at school? What was it
Mm.
like there? Were there more enablers there, or how was that for you?
Hmm. So I have always been, I mentioned kind of curiosity already.
Mhm.
I've always been quite a curious person. I've also, I've never, I have also loved planning. So I've always had a bit of a plan for at least the next 5-ish years for what it
Mhm.
is I'm planning to do.
Mhm.
Roughly, I've got these kind of huge goals that are much more long term, and then I kind of break them down into 5-year chunks. And
Mhm.
because I'm very talkative, I talk a lot,
That's all
a
right.
lot, and at school, I remember always being told that I talk too much. I feel
Mhm.
like my parents will remember that very well, which meant that like parents' evenings and just conversations with teachers, they'd always be like, oh, there's so much potential, there's so many things that you could do, but you talk too much. And that
Right.
might be the problem here. Throughout class, all you do is talk throughout. And I remember that always being something I was battling with, especially when I was working hard. Grade one, quite an academic person. So good
Mhm.
grades are always something that I've strived for and been able to get. But that's always been the thing, like you talk too much. And it wasn't until I was choosing my A levels
Mhm.
that I chose psychology. And
Mhm.
that was my kind of first understanding of how talking too much, potentially, or talking, not talking too much, but talking in general, and curiosity and liking people and being quite social might be helpful work-wise. Because I
Yeah.
didn't choose psychology initially. I'm quite a creative person, which
Mhm.
I now do as part of my career. But back in the
Yeah.
day, I just did art and photography for my A level. And about 3 weeks in, I thought, no, I think I need something more robust. And then I went back and begged to
Yeah.
change and add psychology into the mix.
Yeah.
From then I thought, yeah, this is it. This is exactly what I need to do.
It's interesting that you say that they thought you were too talkative, right? And when you think about when we're the first things that we learn is kind of like through visual, hearing. As babies, we hear and we see and we hear. Those are probably the main things. And then throughout life, most of the things which, unless you have some impairment, most of the things which we do, it's through hearing, it's through listening and seeing. So it's really strange that within academic and within school environments, you're supposed to just be quiet and not talk and converse your ideas.
Yes. Oh my goodness, that's very true. Because school, I mean, I guess now working in education the way I do now in higher education, it's very clear how different statutory kind of high school, primary school, it's so clear how different the approach and the definition of education is. And
Yeah.
you're absolutely right that all throughout school, the aim of the game isn't to be expressive and to develop, despite the fact that that's a byproduct. I think all of us do most of our
Mm-hmm.
development during those years, but it's not by design. I
Mm-hmm.
don't feel like education is meant for that.
Mm-hmm.
If you do, then that's a miracle. Good for you.
Yeah, yeah. So, it's strange because I know that you are very creative, and so you had these two strands going. There's the creative side, the photography
Yeah.
and the art, and then you've got the psychology side going on. So, what then kept you drawn towards the psychology, as it were? What kept you
Yeah.
in?
I think clarity. I am a planner, and
Mm-hmm.
I like to know what I'm doing or what's
Mm-hmm.
happening. And at the time, I mean, art at when you're 17 or 8, however old you are at A levels, is fun. It's not entrepreneurial art or art as a discipline. It's just fun ultimately. And psychology for me felt like clarity, because I felt like I knew what I was doing. When you do psychology as an undergraduate, as an A level, you're talking about theories and things like that I now know in retrospect was the foundation of much of the education I had afterwards. I went on to do a psychology undergraduate degree and then went on to do a psychiatry postgraduate degree, and I can still identify the things that I was first introduced to at A level. And because I like clarity and I like to plan roughly, I think I was more drawn to psychology because there was something I could align myself to, something I could work towards, because I like to feel like I'm driving towards something. So I imagine now that I'm thinking back that that's probably what allowed psychology to feel so much more accessible and exciting for me than art, which I've always enjoyed, and as I said, now do in my own kind of way. But at the time, it was just something that I could do, that I was good at, that I enjoyed, but wasn't necessarily a career plan.
So it was a psychology which, for want of a better word, almost like gave you some grounding, some surety,
yes,
as opposed to the arts was good and you could be expressive, but you also wanted. So it was almost, if I'm hearing right, the art was a little bit more, not abstract in terms of abstract art, but it was less secure, which didn't come in line with your kind of like, I like to know by planning ahead. So it didn't necessarily, I'm just trying to work it out if that's kind of like what's happening.
I think, because I mean, it's interesting again now that everything is more interesting in retrospect, first of all. But now, so at the moment, I have an illustration practice. So I also, as well as working in mental health and teaching, I also illustrate, and I work on projects and work with other organizations to bring illustration to life for them. And it's interesting, people often ask me now, is this creative practice you have something that you're aiming to do full time? You know, when someone has a kind of side hustle, the aim of the game is always to get rid of a full-time job and do this full time. I would never do that. It's just, it doesn't tick the boxes. And I think that when I was thinking about psychology, I also did a business A level. So it was art, photography, psychology, and business. And when I was thinking about this choice between creativity and more, I guess, scientific or more robust, psychology ticks more boxes for me, because I like to, again, have certainty and plan ahead, but I also like to work things out and problem solve. I'm very much an idea generator, problem solver. Psychology did that for me in a way that art doesn't. I also like people. I really like being able to support people, work people out, listen to what they're saying and work out what that means. Art didn't tick those boxes for me. So as well as clarity and certainty that psychology gave me, it also ticked more boxes in terms of what I need to feel at the end of the day like I've been fulfilled.
Yeah. So you've moved into, so you said that you've got your degree in psychology and then your postgraduate degree in psychiatry. What was it that kept drawing you for more and more study and to understand the practice of mental health, as it were? And is it mental health? Because I'm making it is mental health which we're referring to.
That's right. Yeah. So psychology is a much broader discipline. It's got so many different aspects to it, including childhood psychology and some of the more biological processes, health psychology. It's a really broad discipline that involves the mind and the workings of the mind. And mental health is a subset of psychology. At the time, it was called abnormal psychology. That drew me. I think it's just the curiosity of it all. The idea of, I think it was just the unusualness, if I'm honest with you, of mental health and mental ill health and different diagnoses that someone can develop that have these different array of symptoms that out of all the scientific disciplines we probably know the least about. There was just all these different things. I am a really nosy person by nature. I am curious. So I remember doing this abnormal psychology module and thinking, yeah, this is me. I would love to know more about this, which meant that when I left my undergrad degree, having kind of focused down on that, my dissertation was in kind of like cognitive perceptions, and I like clothes and fashion and dressing, and at the time I was a bit more that way inclined, less so now.
Right.
So I did a dissertation on cognitive perceptions and how first impressions and how someone looks and dresses might change someone's cognitive perception. And that was interesting. It was fun. But then going into the industry straight after my undergrad degree, I went to work in a school. Didn't tick my boxes. School children is not my client group. So I left that very quickly because I don't really like working with children. And then I went straight into a further ed college as a mental health support lead. And this marry between education and mental health was exactly what I was looking for, because I am very academic. I love education. I love the meaning that it provides for people, and the idea that you can have this structure for 3 years where you can just learn something new every day. I love that sort of thing. So finding myself in this education space doing mental health stuff just happened naturally from going from a school to a college. And that's kind of what kept me going, because after that experience I thought, you know what, there's a lot more I don't know. And whilst I've done a broad psychology undergrad degree, now I know that mental health and psychiatry is what I'm interested in. I'm going to go back and do a master's.
I'm going to just pick you up on that quickly, just in terms of you've given us that kind of like broad brush kind of like overview of going from from throughout your education and then going on. What was it that got you pinpointed to say, was there any specific event or anything like that which kind of like got you thinking, actually, this is the part, this element about psychology, this element about mental health psychology or psychiatry is what I really want to go into? Was there a trigger? That's what I'm...
Yes, okay. Thinking back, I am thinking that the trigger or the kind of push at the time, I think, was people. It was the people. Because in order to do this work, you basically have to sit with someone for an hour, either once or over an amount of time, and get them to share with you what they define as important in order for you to identify what's wrong. And that, again, I think is very subjective in terms of what's wrong and what's normal. And then from that assessment, you have to then identify and work out and collaborate and problem solve to work out what might help. And if you do that well, then at the end of your intervention, that person feels better. And if you do that once, you want to do it again. I know that the first time that when you realize that this practice, this broad academic practice that we all do, when you realize that what that actually translates to is people, like one-to-one, one person at a time people, I think that for me, I think you either love that or you hate that. And for me, I thought, yes, I love this. It's the people, because that's what contextualizes all of this talk about psychology and what people like and what people want. When you actually meet someone, and at the time it was young people, and I was saying, and I thought, this is exactly what I want to do. But to affect change, I think I'd want to work more with someone as they get older. That felt like my space that I could be most effective. And I think that still stands. It's the people and how the change you can affect, the impact you can make. And also selfishly, which I think comes up for a lot of people that work in supportive roles, how it makes you feel when you feel like you can help. I like the way that makes me feel. And I like that you can collaborate with someone to work out what will make them feel better.
So, out of interest, I'm going to ask you what was the most interesting case, but were there any cases which kind of like stood out in the way in which the intervention which you had to make helped, and I'm coming back to the idea of belonging, helped that individual gain a better sense of belonging, a better sense of who their identity was?
That is another great question. I guess I can think more, especially when we think about belonging. I think this is really important. I'll think about my current experiences. I currently work as a mental health advisor, as you mentioned, in a university. I also am a lecturer at that university, so I teach cultural studies. And I've got, UAL It's an arts institution. They do lots of wonderful things, but like many institutions, there are very few Black students in comparison to everyone else. Ultimately, we know that when it comes to admissions and student bodies. And there are a few Black students that I have on my caseload that I have from year to year. And when I think about them specifically and think about the shock and surprise they have when they walk into their room, when they fill out a referral form because they're struggling and they need help. They send it off to our administrators, which feels like they're sending it off into the abyss. I think help seeking is a difficult thing for anyone, especially when you feel marginalized in your space. So they send off this referral form, this abstract form. They do all the admin processes and book their appointments and go through the waiting list. And then they turn up at my office and I'm me. And there's that first interaction where they think, oh my God, thank God. Thank God. There are lots of things that I won't have to explain now because we have this shared understanding. And that's validating for them. And that's validating for me because it allows you to remember why it's important to be present in spaces where there's very few of you. And that's something that, you know, the very few students I have that are students of color or that are Black students specifically, I have thousands of students I've seen over the years that have been absolutely brilliant and that I feel like I've been really helpful for, and they felt that I've been helpful. But the students of colour have stood out to me because there is so much that you can do where they feel like the only one and you know you're the only one, but together you can make that kind of change and potentially retain that person in their education, or allow them to feel that they can exist in this kind of art space, for example, where they're thinking, from now until forever, I might be one of very few, but actually the conversations that we're having are helping me to contextualize what I might look like in my future. So just all these little mini things that happen. And that's the case for loads of marginalized communities and groups. There are loads of different groups of students, depending on their demographic, that will have conversations where we can relate in a way that feels very unique to both of us, despite our differences, because I exist in this space. And that feels really important to me. And those kind of interventions, they stand out.
It's ironic, or we haven't planned this, really, we haven't planned this, right? But it's the illustration that you gave, kind of like talking about being the only one and thinking about the whole idea of this week being Mental Health Awareness Week. And one of the elements about Mental Health Awareness Week is that idea of loneliness. And loneliness becomes apparent when you feel that you are the only one who understands what you're going through. And so that positionality which you have in your institution can just be a ray of hope. I'm not the only one, or I've got someone who understands, you know.
That's exactly it. And it's interesting that you bring that up, because I talk a lot in my research and just in conversations I have, I talk about this word recovery, which I think means different things to different people depending on their position and their frame of reference. But there is a really brilliant paper that I always refer to that maps out this wheel of recovery, that identifies what are the elements that make up someone's recovery journey. And recovery, I think back in the day, traditionally, the idea of recovery is that you have an ailment or there's something wrong and then you're cured, it's better, and you no longer have that ailment, you have recovered, miracle. But in reality, recovery is a much more complex process. It's very person-centered. It might be with or without the presence of the thing that you're trying to recover from. It depends on your experience. And one of the key, some of the key elements of that are things like being in a tolerant community, or being in a community that you feel understands you and sees you. Another element of it is visibility. So feeling like you're seen, feeling like you exist, basically, as opposed to being invisible and appearing like you're not even there. Things like peer support, things like responsibility, all of these different things make up recovery. And sometimes when you think about our students or think about our staff, the Black, or the people of the staff of colour, actually, I want to be much more inclusive about all of us that are in institutions where we're the only ones. We're trying to look after and prioritise our well-being and continue to exist so we can continue doing the work that we're doing. And we find ourselves not having some of the key elements that make up this idea of recovery. Things like being seen, or feeling like there are peers around you that understand your experiences. It might not be that you have the same background, but there's some sort of familiarity you have that means that when you go to work and come home, you know that you was there because there was
Yeah.
someone else who actually saw you.
Yeah.
And this Mental Health Awareness Week theme, as you said, this idea of isolation and loneliness, I think it goes beyond this idea of like having friends or having family around you. It really does tap into how you feel in your career and how you feel in your teams, and whether you feel like the work that you're doing, especially if you're doing kind of social justice work or work that's very specific, whether you feel like it's making an impact or whether you're just kind of doing it to do, and then when you go home, no one kind of registers what you've done. All of these things tap into what our understanding of isolation should be.
Yeah, yeah. It's fascinating, it really is, how those elements come together. If you don't mind, later on, if you could give me the reference for that wheel of recovery, because I think it's something that all of us would really like to get a hold of. Because it's you're right. The standard idea is you put an intervention in somebody else, you get better. But it is a process, and I think if we don't understand that process, we can remove an intervention too early.
Yes.
Or we can be using the wrong intervention, which isn't actually working for that individual, and we don't actually stop to recognize that, or we're compounding the problem.
And in addition to that, if you aren't clear on what recovery means for you, then your expectations can't be managed. So you never feel like you're there. You never feel like you're in a good place because there was no clarity as to what recovery meant for you in the first place. So you're constantly striving for this thing that we never had a chance to identify. And I think that's something that, in my mind, is much bigger than us. I think it's a systems difficulty, an issue, it's an institutional issue, it's a societal issue. But I think it starts with us. I think we can only do what we can do. And if we don't work out what recovery means for us, then we miss out on our chance to be well, or at least strive for that. I think we should all be in this constant pursuit of trying to be as well as we can, despite institutions and society, as opposed to because of, potentially.
I love that. If you can, give me some simple kind of interventions that we can, or not even self-interventions, because I think understanding self is also a key element to it. But other things, if we encounter somebody who maybe we feel needs that additional support, etc., what practical things could we do?
Yes, I love that question. And I'm looking at the time. I want to make sure I answer this briefly, but there's so much to say. So I say recently, it was probably December now, last year and the year before, I did a postgrad certificate in academic practice, which was great because it consolidated a lot of this education and mental health stuff. And as a part of that, I did some research with HERAG, HERAG, Higher Education Race Action Group. So I did a workshop with some of the members of HERAG on recovery and what might recovery look like for us in higher education. And there's this, and I can send you some of that research that I'm writing up as well, because it talks about all this stuff we're talking about. But if we consider, all of us, when we're thinking about what we need to be well, if you imagine that we all have a vessel, this kind of metaphor is called a stress bucket or stress container. So someone might have come across it before. But if you imagine that we all have a vessel or a bucket, each of us have one. And the sizes of our containers vary depending on our life experiences, our upbringing, our current difficulties. Our container varies depending on who we are. And as we call it a stress bucket, our stress flows into the top of that bucket. And that could be lifelong stresses like institutional racism. It could be tiny stresses like being forced to work on campus when we would like to work from home. It could be something even more tiny, like us missing our train and being late for something important. Our stress is constantly flowing into this bucket, and it varies depending on how big that stress is. Now, because our stress container, which actually represents our vulnerability, is finite, we don't have this unlimited resource that we can just continue to bring in stress. We have this size container, it stays the same, which means that at some point, if our stress keeps filling in, it will overflow. Ultimately, that's how containers work. And one of the things that I recommend us all doing is, one, identifying what's in our stress container at any given point. What are the things that we're noticing are flowing into that container? Two, working out what happens. What is this emotional snapping that we experience when that container overflows? What does that look like for you? Does that include you completely withdrawing? Does that include you snapping at everyone around you? Does that lead to you overworking? Work out what that looks like. But also the key here, which is the coping and the strategies, is that all of our containers have a tap at the bottom that can be opened and shut. And the opening of that tap only happens with coping strategies, positive coping strategies. Things like identifying what you need in your environment, seeing people that fulfill you more, going to bed more often, in a better fashion, eating better because you find yourself feeling more sluggish and lethargic. Opening and closing that tap is what allows that stress to flow in, which is something that's a given. We can't stop stress from flowing in. But what we can do is work out what opens our tap. And that's what allows that stress to flow in, but then flow out the other way. And it's the work that we need to do to work out what opens our tap. That's where we need to kind of work. We need to focus with ourselves and think, what is it that I can do that opens that tap and lets that stress flow out? And then we can start to think about whether we do that in a preventative way when we find ourselves knowing that more stress is going to flow in, or in a reactive way when we realize actually this container is very full, it's right at the top. If one more thing drops in here, it's over. I need to open this tap now after a crisis. Whether we respond to ourselves in a preventative or reactive way is fine. We meet ourselves where we can, but just knowing that we have this container and knowing what's in it is the first step, and then working out how to open that tap is next.
Listen,
Hope that helps.
The illustration of that simple illustration is just phenomenal. Really phenomenal. There was a quote which just came up in the chat which is saying, it sounds like you're talking directly to me. I think if I'm honest, I know I could have written that same quote.
I'm talking to me too, trust me, there's a lot of things in my container right now.
It's coming in. And the beauty of it was the release valve.
That's key.
That's very key. Yeah. The release valve, and recognizing what your release is. How do you release? Is it that you go for a run? Is it that you you go and sing songs or whatever else, what it is? But know what it is. It's almost like that self-soothing.
Exactly. That's exactly what it is. Exactly that. And it might be a self action. It might be that opening the tap is setting boundaries and saying to the people around you, my container is very full, and to open my tap, I need to set some boundaries around how we communicate for a couple of days. Whatever it is, it's the opening of that tap that allows that stress to flow out. We can't get rid of the container or make it bigger so we can take in more stress. We got to open that tap.
That's right. I love that illustration. I'm stealing it. I don't care.
You should, yes. Tell everyone. I think if we all knew about it, we'd have this shared language that allows us all to know where we all are.
Yeah. And it's kind of like, it would be easy to then just walk into the room and say, I'm on tap number 3 now.
Yep. My container is this close from the top, so watch out.
Exactly. That's superb. I like to open up the questions. If there are any questions which anyone would like to ask to Amberlee, then please get them ready, put your hands up, etc. But otherwise, I will continue to ask some more questions. Amberlee, it's just amazing, right? It's just amazing what you do and where you're doing that. There was one question which I wanted to ask. It wasn't necessarily around, you talked about the fact that you do illustrations, right? And you enjoy art and whatever else. Have you thought about combining that with the way in which you work within a mental health advisory capacity to as kind of like, I know of things like play therapy and stuff like that, to use some kind of art illustration therapy or something like that. I don't know. It's just, it's whether or not that might be a way of giving the students their tap, is providing them their tap. in some way. I don't know.
I hear you, yeah. So there was a time, not that long ago, before COVID, I think, where all of these bits of me felt very separate and distinct. I felt like I was kind of stepping into my kind of mental health space at work 5 days a week, and then having to take all those clothes off and put on my creative clothes in the evenings and weekends. But actually, COVID helped a lot, but also just this kind of striving for more harmony. They actually come together so much more now. So there is some work that I do, you know, I spoke at a conference about 2 years ago that the theme was illustration and mental health specifically. Such a niche conference. I think it's the only one that I've seen on that theme. So I delivered a workshop there with one of my colleagues, and I did write a paper that was published, a peer-reviewed paper in the Journal of Illustration that spoke about, I wrote about the link between mental health and illustration, specifically for Black women, and how our depiction in art and illustration has a huge impact on our mental health. So actually in recent years, I have been bringing them together in a way that feels really aligned with me. And I think that's mostly been through research, interestingly, as opposed to practice. So like this idea of kind of art therapy and play therapy is really wonderful. And I assumed it would have gone in that direction. But actually, where illustration and mental health have met has happened to be through my research.
Right.
More so. Right. So I'm kind of talking a lot more about that in my work now. And I'm quite liking this space. It feels good for them all to overlap in a way that's less exhausting than before, when I felt like I was living 3 lives.
So it's kind of like consolidated, yes, but not necessarily and coalesce, but not necessarily in the way that you may have thought it would have.
Yes,
in practical practice as such.
Yes,
that's really interesting. I'm no artist. I'll be honest with you. But I just do really like that whole idea, and I did start doing a little doodle. I won't show anybody, but
we'd love to see.
No, you don't. This is rudimentary. That's what I'll call it. But when you're
part of the process.
When you're giving the illustration of the stress bucket, I kind of like had it looks more like in scientific terms, a burette. So you've got the strands coming down and then the top at the bottom, but it got it pinned in for me.
Yeah.
So where would you like to see the 2 elements that we've been discussing? How do you see them developing for you in the future?
Such a good question. So that's a really good question. I usually have a very clear understanding of what's next. And this last year or so, I found myself thinking I'm in this weird space in between 5-year chunks where I don't quite know what comes next. But interestingly, I just so happen to be coming towards the end of my role as a mental health advisor. So I'm actually leaving that role imminently because I have a new role in a mental health charity as their head of impact. Which I'm really excited about. So I'll continue to teach. It's a mental health charity that I will be basically working on, I guess, measuring how this mental health educational kind of interventions that they deliver, how do they impact those that they're supporting? What is our impact in the broader sense and industry that we're going to be working in? And also how to communicate that. So this is actually a really new, this is very new news, basically, because it's just happening now. But I feel like this is the beginning of a new chapter. This is the beginning of a new chapter, but also the end of me working in this kind of mental health advisory kind of practitioner role for the past kind of 10 years, basically. So I'm hoping that, it will develop in that way. And I'll continue to teach and research and cultural studies and continue to illustrate and kind of see where I go there. Everything's been so organic up until this point. So I think it's quite nice to leave some room for more organic growth going forward.
I think that's fantastic, and good luck with the new role. Right, we're here to support you. All of a sudden, I've got a deluge of questions, so I'm gonna go with Pramjeet. I hope is it Pramjeet?
Yeah, that's right. That's fine.
Thanks. Would you like to ask your question? Thanks.
Yeah. Amberlee, I love that analogy you gave, that example you gave. That was brilliant. I'll be using that myself. But my question was really, So in Britain, we're quite diverse, as you know, we've got a diverse community, and mental health is viewed differently in some cultures. You've probably asked this question many times, but I was just thinking, you know, with younger children in school and the kind of upbringing they might have at home and views that their families might have on mental health, what is there to support people or young children with that kind of thought?
Yeah,
it might be different. You know, the way mental health is viewed is different from an early age.
Yeah, that's such a good question. So I guess there's two strands, one of which is the more like what services are available, which we know mental health wise, well, health wise in general, there's this scarcity of resources. There's always more demand than resources and waiting lists and etc. etc. But the other strand that I feel taps more into my view actually is mental health literacy, this idea of emotional literacy. I feel like what is needed, especially for our young people, our young children, is these conversations that we're having, the conversations around a stress bucket, the conversations around preventative versus reactive support, conversations around what recovery means, and that whenever we're talking about mental ill health or stress or having a hard time, we should always be talking about recovery. They should go hand in hand at all times. All of these conversations that we, especially people of colour, should be having with our communities, with our children, all of this stuff, it increases the population's emotional literacy. Because I think the issue is that we do all this work on awareness and asking people to help seek, but we don't, as a people, have the words to describe how we're feeling anyway. So you kind of overcome this barrier where you think, there is something wrong and I'd love to seek help for it, but I have no idea what to say. I have no way of putting words to all of these complex emotions that I'm feeling. And we are now having to relearn that now as adults. But actually some of the younger people that we're around, all the people in our societies and communities, I feel like our focus should be emotional literacy and mental health literacy, and allowing us all to develop the words to put to emotions in a way that allows for natural conversations where you can describe how you're feeling in a way that feels aligned with how you actually are feeling, rather than the stress container filling up because there are no words and then emotional snapping happening and everyone thinking that's a problem child. When actually we haven't solved any of the difficulties that led to that stress container filling up. Yeah. I think that would be my answer. The focus should be emotional literacy or mental health literacy.
Brilliant. So that people are able to articulate what it is that they're feeling, how it is. So it's also a call for more openness.
And transparency. And
and a reduction in the stigmatization of you know, I don't want people to perceive me in this particular way, because that's adding to the mental health stresses which they have.
And it always feels aspirational when we talk about this, because that sounds wonderful in theory, but there are so many difficulties that we'd have to break through just to be able to do something as wonderful as that. So I always feel like my answers are really aspirational and dreamlike when I say things like that, because I know that in reality there are so many layers that we'd have to work through to get even to that point where there's more emotional literacy and less stigma.
Yeah, fantastic.
Does that answer your question, Pramjit? Does that feel?
It does. It's obviously I'm from an Indian background, and I've got a little boy that's 4 years old, and I was just thinking, how do you pick things up like that in children at such a young age? Because that mental health can happen at any stage, you know. It develops, doesn't it? It can happen whenever. And I was just thinking, in schools, even at that young age, how are teachers, how is the school, how are parents equipped to deal with mental health? And then secondly, when there is a different culture, a mental health is viewed differently, because I might have my views on mental health, but my grandparents and my parents' view is different, and that will seep through.
Absolutely.
My little boy, he's so I'm Indian and my partner is Jamaican, so he's coming from two cultures who I think that the view on mental health is probably similar in both those cultures anyway. But it's just, when you have that, how do you then, as a parent or, you know, teacher, whoever, how do you explain explain the differences in different
Absolutely. Yeah, well, the stress bucket is a great illustration for all ages, I think, because it's so visual, but also this understanding that mental health is on a continuum. So mental health and mental ill health, there are so many options in between having really positive mental health and not having quite negative mental health at the time. And knowing that there are so many options in this spectrum or this continuum is important, because it allows us to have a more nuanced view of how we're all doing. So people don't, so our kids and those around us don't feel so stigmatized not feeling too good, because there are so many different options you could have. But also this understanding that our mental health is very movable. So the joy of a continuum is that we're always kind of going up and down it, depending on how we're doing that day, which means that at any point that you're not feeling good, there's just as good a chance that that's going to move as well. If you could move towards negative mental health, you can move back towards positive mental health. So again, this idea of recovery, when it's always spoken about, whenever you talk about distress, always talk about what recovery might look like for that distress, so that we're not isolating distress as this horrible thing that happens in the darkness, and recovery is what we're all pretending that we have. They should be spoken about together so that we all know that we're always able to move up and down that continuum.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Those questions, Pramjit. It was really good. I've got two other questions. I know we're almost at time. We are at time, but there's two other questions which I'd like us to just, if you don't mind, to just look at. And they've come in from Crystal, and it's, how do you think mental health should be factored into expectations in the workplace? Is this consideration what is leading to businesses to permit workers to continue working from home a significant amount of time, despite wanting everyone back 5 days a week? Yeah. So that's kind of like the first one. And then the second question is about, is a life free of mental stress unavoidable? What happens if you refuse to open the tap rather than putting boundaries around it? Perhaps that in itself is a mental divergence, perhaps leading to isolation or lack of connection.
Yes, love that question. If I understand it correctly, I think I love that question. I'll do the second one first, and I'll try to be brief. So a life free of distress, you cannot avoid that. Day-to-day life, we cannot avoid distress. Mental health or positive mental health and well-being is something that we all want and all strive for, and that does not mean there is an omission of stress. Stress, anxiety, it's a normal range of human emotion. It's going to happen. Always is going to happen, first of all. But this idea of refusing to open the tap, you're absolutely right, that can happen. Sometimes we find ourselves in a space of self-sabotage. Sometimes you find yourself opening the tap or thinking you're opening the tap, and actually what you're doing is allowing all that stress to flow out and come right back in the top, because that opening is actually not a helpful coping strategy at all, but actually an unhelpful coping strategy. So there are all these different variations of how we operate with our stress. Some of it can be beyond our control. We know, for example, with depression, that you struggle with motivation, simple things you can't do, things like getting up in the morning and going to work, you can't self-start. So there might be times where you can't open your tap in any way, and that might be where we think about, who can we rope in to help us open that tap when we need it? Or what can we do that's in our environment anyway, like having a roof over our head, that means that there's always a tiny bit of a trickle coming out of that tap. There really is a difference. I think you're absolutely right that there are going to be times when that tap either refuses to open or it's clogged, because what we think we're opening to be helpful is actually really unhelpful. And whether we call it mental deviance or not, I think that mental health distress and disorders and diagnoses do come from people being unable to open their tap. But even then, there are processes that, with the right support around you, I do kind of suggest that we all need to have a community around us. When people are isolated, it's so hard to open your tap by yourself. I think that's where that kind of comes in.
It's a spiral effect. Absolutely. If you're isolating yourself, if you're lonely and there's no one to help you to open the tap when you're unable to open the tap for yourself, it just gets worse and worse and worse and worse and worse.
Exactly. Especially if isolation is what you needed. If you needed alone time, so you open your tap because you need space from everyone, and that was really flowing through, it was working, and then that isolation becomes too much, it becomes chronic, and all of a sudden what used to flow through has now become clogged. More complexity.
I love that. And the second one was kind of like the concept between the expectation of working from home, but despite wanting people back in the workplace for 5 days a week.
I think that's completely cultural. These different organizations, they have these views of what well-being looks like. But I think you know how they feel about well-being when you look at their stances on things like allowing people freedom to work where is best for them. But I think, I wish I had an answer to that, because I myself am in this work environment where we're kind of battling with what people want and what we want and all of this sort of stuff. So I do think that mental health should be factored into the workplace. In fact, it should be factored in just as much as performance, more so than performance, I feel, obviously, being biased. I think that's a wonderful question, something that I wish I could solve in this time. But I do think that there's a huge link between how organizations say they feel about well-being and what they do to allow their staff the chance to achieve that. That helps.
Thank you for those two questions, Crystal. Absolutely brilliant. And Amberlee, thank you so much for your candid answers. I always leave or finish off with this final question, and that is, what advice would you have given to your younger self about where you would end up and your journey into belonging?
Yes. I have the reason why I have this answer a bit more freely than I think I would have usually is because I have thought about this recently when speaking to someone else, luckily, because otherwise that's a huge question. So I would say to my younger self that you don't have to be just one thing. I think before I got into the space that I'm in now, where I'm doing all these different things and have all these different hats and they're all complementary, I spent so long feeling, it links really well to this word belonging, I felt so long worried that if I didn't choose or pick something, instead of having this kind of curiosity to do everything, I would never felt like I belonged. I wouldn't be able to find the space that I exist in because I had too many things on the go. But I'm realizing now that all of that kind of overthinking and worrying and stressing about choosing one thing so that I could feel like I belong is a myth, because you as a person, me as a Black woman, for example, I can be 1,000 things as much as I want or as little as I want at any given point. And just doing it and showing up is all that is needed. It's enough.
Fantastic. Amberlee, it's been absolutely brilliant having you on. I've got some illustrations, I've got some references which I need to go back and read. It's just been the whole package. So I want to say a really big thank you for sharing your belonging journey with us today.
Thank you for having me. Thank you everyone for being here.
Yeah, brilliant. I'm going to just share with everyone what's happening for next week. So next week we're going to have Dr. Jadel Bidmus, and he's an advanced research fellow in the Department of Infectious Disease at Imperial College. And so that's going to be another really good interview as well. And if you haven't seen any of the previous belonging videos or belonging interviews, then please go to our YouTube site and you'll be able to see the backlog or the back catalogue of all of the interviews. And there was just one final thing that I wanted to say. This week marks our second birthday. We have now been doing belonging for 2 years. Okay, and today I should have bought some cake, but I thought that would be bad to have me sit here eating cake on camera. But it is 2 years since we've been doing belonging, and I'd like to just say a big thank you to everyone who has supported us over those 2 years, all of our guests and the viewers who have tuned in. So let's hope we can have another few more years of belonging and sharing our stories. But once again, I want to just say to Amberlee, thank you for being our 2-year guest. And it's really been another fantastic interview. So thank you.
Thank you, Wayne.
All right.
Thank
If
you,
anyone
everyone.
wants to stay on, I'm stopping the recording.